Welcome back to another episode from the Optimal Body Podcast. I'm Doc Jen.
And I'm Dr. Dom.
And we are talking about high arches today. So we've already done a podcast on flat feet. You can look back at the video for that one. But now we're going to talk about the opposite, the high arch. What does it mean? Is it bad? What can you do? Does it cause pain? All the things.
All right, another PT pearl that is really something that I deal with and have kind of dealt with for life is high arches or Pes Cavus, however you're going to want to pronounce it.
Yeah, Pes meaning foot. And Cavus meaning hollow hole. So you have a hollow hole in your foot.
Hollow hole in my foot. I've got a hollow hole in my head. I've got a lot of hollow holes.
And this is obviously not as common of one. So if you're dealing with flat feet, we've already done that episode. You can look back on that. That's actually episode 122. We already talked about flat feet, what that means, what you can do. So go look at or listen to that one if you haven't.
So many other episodes about foot and ankle stuff as well that we've done in the past, but like Achilles tendonitis, plantar fasciitis, bunions, bunionettes, all those things. So lots of information if you get anything from this one to dive back into. But high arches. I have high arches. I've had them for most all my life. And a lot of the times it matters most when we're having symptoms or when we're really dealing with pain, when we're dealing with a decreased amount of function because of it.
Right.
So I don't want anyone to listen to this episode and freak out and say, oh, I've got high arches and they said all these different things.
Right.
You know, if you're not having significant symptoms at this point, or it's not preventing you from doing the activities and the daily function that you need to do, it might not be that concerning for you.
High arches really is like that longitudinal arch is what we're looking at. So we technically have 3 arches in the foot. And the longitudinal arch is what is most commonly known or referred to when we're doing like exercise, stuff like that. So it's going from the ball of the foot, so underneath that big toe, to the heel. That's your longitudinal arch right on the inside. And so that means it's going to be a little bit higher. So if my toes are more pointing down, then my heel is actually going to be lifted the other way, then kind of lifted up toward the shin.
Again, this presents in so many different ways. Like that's just a broad generalization of like how these higher arches develop. Front of the foot goes down, back of the foot points up. You can imagine that it's going to create a little bit of an arch there. It's amazing because the foot acts both like a spring and like a rigid lever that is able to launch us and then cushion us. So again, if we have a more arched foot that doesn't go as much into a flat foot, that's kind of what I've dealt with. You don't have that as much of that spring.
Yeah, you lose that flexibility.
Totally. So then it can cause a little bit more of what we call a ground impact force. When we hit the ground, our joints are going to notice that a little bit more. There's going to be a little bit more consistent pressure through joints all the way up the chain because of it.
So we have Pes Cavovarus, Pes Calcaneovarus, and Pes Cavus, which is commonly what it's known as, but not maybe the most common.
Totally. And one of the most common is the first one you mentioned, which is Pes Cavovarus.
Yeah.
What's really indicative of this one is that you get this plantar flexion or pointing down, more specifically of the first metatarsal. And what the first metatarsal is, if you look at your big toe, it's the bone that kind of leads into the big toe. Along with that, you get sometimes this clawing of the toes.
Yeah, so the claw-toe deformity.
Yeah, claw-toe deformity. And that's where sometimes with this Cavovarus foot, they start talking about how it could deal with or be indicative of, peripheral nerves or things not quite getting all the way down to our toes as well as they could, because we're seeing that clawing, which is also indicative in other like neurologic disorders. And so like sometimes they'll say people who have Charcot-Marie tooth, which is essentially a disorder that our foot generally loses a lot of that nervous system feeding it, and it forgets how to support itself, and it kind of collapses on itself, which is a really bad way of thinking about it. But your arch starts to get all these contractures, and then eventually
your foot's coming into that general contraction.
Yeah, the arch just keeps getting higher, right? And then the toes start to claw more and more back because our nerves might be demyelinating or might not be getting as much of the nutrients or messages that they need down to those muscles and tissues.
Oftentimes, it's thought of to be idiopathic. It could also, they've seen as possible associations with rheumatoid arthritis or ankle osteoarthritis. So again, we're not using the function of our feet. And they've also looked at it as like typically it's like a contracture of our fibularis longus. So our fibularis longus is a muscle that is on the outside of your shin. So think of it from like the knee on the outside and then all the way down. It wraps under the foot all the way to the ball of the big toe, right? So if that's kind of just like contracted there, we can have that like pulling of the arch. That's a muscle we actually want to engage and we want to kind of get back to working, you know, to be more active, to control that arch. But when we're already in such a high position, that muscle is already kind of in that contracted state. And then we can go into some of the other ones. So Pes Calcaneovarus.
Calcaneus meaning the heel. They basically, in this one, just say forefoot or the toes are more plantar flexed or towards the ground and the heel is more dorsiflexed, right? This is actually, if you imagine or if you've ever seen somebody who has a foot due to having gotten polio, their foot is just really almost looks like it's crunched together where the heel and the back of the foot or the hind foot has really come up towards the shin a lot and the toes have really flexed down towards the ground a lot.
And that's like also calf weakness and stuff, but you're not going to see that one as common anymore. And then the last one we talk about is Pes Cavovarus. And this is just, again, we're talking about the arch of the heel, but only due because the forefoot, so that front of the foot, where the met head, so kind of like the bones that meet the toes, is really pointing down. So as a result of that pointing down, then the body is like compensatory. The heel is then lifting up, but that's only arching because of what's happening at the forefoot. So like it could be post-trauma, it could be post-surgery, you know, and
just repetitive behaviors.
Yeah, repetitive behavior. So something that starts to develop because of that foot kind of pointing down in the front.
After all that was a lot to go through.
Yeah.
And a lot of medical terminology. But again, what's it all mean? And how does it affect my movement up the chain? I just know that with my high arches, even though I didn't have a lot of symptoms throughout life, I always struggled to get into a deep squat without feeling like I was going to fall back. I still do. One small, tiny example of how those high arches and more rigid feet are preventing me from doing basic motor patterns all the way up the chain.
If you think about it, think of your bicep just like your wrist and your forearm like all the way by your shoulder and it's contracted all the time, right? I'm in this tight bicep curl all the time. Well, I'm not going to be able to function well here if I'm staying here.
Well, really, we just need to get your toes and your arch and your metatarsals and all the bones in your feet moving.